Hey, I'm Adrian.
And I'm Mac.
This episode is about queer people of color and how they often face worse circumstances than their white counterparts in the United States.
We just want to preface this episode by saying that we're not trying to speak for POC. We are simply taking stories and facts that we have been given by POC and amplifying their experiences so the public can learn to be better allies. Before we continue, we would just like to issue a trigger warning for the following things: rape, suicide, murder, abuse, violence, and specifically queerphobic violence.
All right, so let's break down the privilege pattern a little bit in the queer community. The leading group are the cis gay men of the community, who are then closely followed by cis lesbian women. Bisexuals, pansexuals, and other multisexual spectrum sexualities face some bigoted rhetoric like the infamous bisexuals are just looking for attention and you can only like one gender, but this behavior is very rarely seen.
The trans community follows because transphobia is more prominent than homophobia. FTM, or female to male trans folk, tend to face less discrimination than MTF, male to female, because of the societal norm that anything feminine is bad, and cis women being afraid of men in their bathrooms and changing rooms, and some questioning why someone would want to be given the burden of being a woman in a patriarchal society. Also, FTM trans folk can sometimes pass on the street as being a tomboy, so they are less likely to be stopped by abusers without first interaction.
Automatically, the homophobic and transphobic rhetoric becomes more apparent if you are a person of color. In regards to the privilege pattern, a queer BIPOC of any kind faces more discrimination than any kind of queer white person. This is especially true for Black Americans who face the worst homophobic and transphobic based discrimination and violence. This violence is not limited to be done by cis-hets, but also white queers. This leads to the whitewashing of historical achievements made by trans women of color.
The historical whitewashing the achievements and visibility for trans and queer POC started with the Stonewall Rebellion, a turning point for queer visibility globally. This is from the 2015 movie Stonewall, that I hate very much in the deep pit of my heart, in which a bunch of mostly white young adults have a fun coming of age story revolving around Stonewall, because that's such a fun, upbeat thing to have a coming of age movie about. It depicted Stonewall as a dive bar-esque club as a hum for white cis gay men full of glamour and romance. The movie was so bad that Rotten Tomatoes gave it a 9%, and critic consensus said as an attempt to depict a pivotal moment in American history, it's offensively bad. It is what most people think happened. And that is the infamous brick throwing scene, and that's some romanticizing tragedy. This is what actually happened. It was a riot. It was police attacking innocent people.
So, the founder of the US Pride movement was Marsha P. Johnson. She was a Black transgender woman and a drag queen who was known as the one who threw the first brick at police and beginning the Stonewall Rebellion. It wasn't really a riot. The Stonewall Club was actually Stonewall Cafe, and it was a safe haven for trans women, drag queens, queer people of color, and those who ran away from home. Marsha was a pioneer and an outspoken activist fighting for the gay liberation movements on the streets. She was arrested and beaten countless times, but she didn't stop until the day she was murdered. She worked closely with another founder of Pride, Sylvia Rivera.
Sylvia Rivera was a trans woman of color who began STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, an organization determined to provide food and shelter to queer youth. She was the target of horrible abuse by her members within and outside the queer community. At a New York Pride event in 1973, the crowd attempted to boo Sylvia off the stage, but in response gave a powerful speech about the abuses she had endured for the movement. She cried about her being raped by a straight man, evicted, and thrown in jail. After her immeasurable dedication to the movement, she died of liver cancer in 2002.
So, society has targeted the trans POC community in horrible ways, ranging from murder, covering up a murder, and refusing to investigate a murder. Devastatingly, Marsha was murdered in 1992, and the documentary The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson discusses the lack of investigation around her murder, as well as the importance of bringing light to these issues because they still happen. At the time of filming, there's an ongoing trial for the murder of a Black trans woman, Islyn Nettles. Her murderer, fortunately, was sent to prison, but only for 12 years. Sylvia and Marcia were both trans women of color who gave their life to gay liberation. There are members of the queer community who don't know who they were or what they accomplished because of racism and transphobia, trying to make pride more digestible to white supremacy and heteronormativity.
And this is them at the 1969 Stonewall protests. In 2020, there were 44 recorded murders of trans or gender nonconforming people in the US and 350 globally, the overwhelming majority being trans women of color, 66% in the US, 79% globally. The unfortunate thing about these statistics is that they're likely a very small fraction of all the deaths that occurred, as many go unreported or misinterpreted. The racism and transphobia from society and the community affect suicide attempt rates, according to data gathered by the Trevor Project in the next slide. 13% of cis whites in the community reported having a suicide attempt in the past year, compared to 21% of cis queer POC. And for trans people, 27% of trans whites reported attempted suicide versus 31% of BIPOC trans people.
So much of the stigma around queerness and transgender issues inside communities stems from the presence of religion in cultures. According to the Human Rights Campaign, the majority of queer Black and Latin Americans are afraid to come out to their family or even to themselves because of religion deeming homosexuality a sin. This is also true for queer people of Islamic faith or those who are raised in that culture. Conservative sects of these religions dominate the social opinion on sexuality and gender in these cultures. Since much of white society has become secular, it is very important for white, queer, and trans people to understand that coming out may be very difficult for people of color because of the emphasis on religion. As seen in this graphic, suicide attempts among cis and trans people differ greatly depending on race.
Even for those who don't practice Abrahamic religions, like many Asian Pacific Islanders, queerness may not be accepted so easily. Asia and the Pacific Islands are vast regions with many different cultures, meaning the general attitudes towards the queer community can vary greatly. However, many of these nations are far less accepting of queer people than other parts of the world. According to the Human Rights Campaign, queer, Asian, and Pacific Islander peoples often have to face families and cultural traditions that are not entirely embracing of their identities. Many API parents view their children coming out as queer as product of Americanization, which leads to harmful opinions along the lines of it's only a phase. Specific examples: Indians from the conservative Hindu background facing discrimination in the form of queerness not being recognized as existing at all. These kinds of remarks led to the creation of organizations like the NQAPIA. The difference in cultures can make it so white Americans don't understand the gravity of coming out if someone is Black, Indigenous, person of color. It is important that cultural sensitivity plays a role in emphasizing having allyship with queer people of color.
So, cultural insensitivity can come in the form of trying to help out as well. Recently, there has been controversy around the phrase Latinx. Adding X in place of O or A does not make sense in Spanish because X is pronounced he. Instead, some Latin and Hispanic people are pushing for the use of replacing O or A with E and pronouncing the he as an E. Examples are Latino, ellos, and amigos becoming Latine, ellas, and amigues. Replacing the O or A for an E can follow Spanish grammar and pronunciation and can be used a lot more fluidly for gendered vocabulary. This is a very new concept and not everyone cares or agrees, but it's worth mentioning because the addition of the X was created by white American culture. It's an example of assumptions based on colonization and not actual Latin and Hispanic culture. Latin and Hispanic cultures or languages are not ours, so it is not our place to assume an X would be a suitable substitute.
The experience of queer Indigenous North Americans is very different of other racial and ethnic groups because of white American colonialism and cultural values. North American Alaskan Native queer individuals have the highest attempted suicide rates. Unfortunately, not a lot of research exists about why these rates are higher, but it can be speculated that the higher propensity of suicide amongst Native Americans translates to queer individuals because of colonization effects on morale and economic disadvantages. The boarding schools forcing assimilation of Indigenous people pushed out their ideas and practice of gender and sexuality, replacing them with Christian values. The pressure to assimilate is still present and also could be preventing inner and outer acceptance of queerness.
So, amongst many of the North American Alaskan Native tribes, there was a recognized third gender. It has many names, particular to each tribe, but Two-Spirit is an umbrella term for all these identities. Someone who is Two-Spirit can have ceremonial significance because of their spirituality being of both man and woman. And in other Indigenous cultures, a third gender's social significance can be as teachers of that culture, doctors, and spiritual leaders. A different perception of gender roles or a lack of gender roles has led to historical acceptance of homosexuality for some communities too. Today, Two-Spirit Pride is celebrated by official Two-Spirit powwows like the annual Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirit Powwow.
These findings highlight the continued need to address homophobia, transphobia, and general bigotry from an intersectional perspective. Different communities within American society face different types of marginalization. Thank you.
Before we go, I just want to highlight once again that we are white. We are just trying to amplify the stories of others so that they have a platform as well. And I implore you, the viewer, to check out some of these things as well and better educate yourself past this video. Thank you.